Thanks for coming, Gary. Is that a threat or a promise? Somebody will take you home. We're live, okay. Well, hi, Johnny. I'm well. How are you? You also. Does anybody else need the handout? We're all good. All right, good. Making sure we're all together now. All right, let's do our weekly review, and then we're going to finish up chapter 13 tonight. So a little less material to cover, just the way it worked out. But some of you have been gone all day. You're ready to go home, take your third or fourth nap for the day. Only the second one. You ought to be tired. Waiting for the Geritol to kick in. We understand. So let's do a review real quick. Remember, we're in the middle of this section. We've got 2 more chapters to go after this. Chapters 11 through 15. These are the purity laws. Things about how to be pure, how to remain in the relationship with God. Remember, we haven't said this in a while, so maybe it's not remember, maybe it's a true reminder here. Are we good? He was out there staring at the TV like, if you push the button harder, it'll work. But we haven't said it in a while. Remember, when all this is going on in Leviticus, they are still at Mount Sinai. Moses has been to the mountaintop. God has initiated the covenant. It must be working fine. Hi, Kevin. Yeah, it doesn't turn me off, so don't even try. God has initiated the covenant. Moses has come down. The people have now begun the process of building the tabernacle. They've got the altar done, all that. We've got priests told how to be ordained. We're ready now to maintain the relationship with God. They're not going to leave Sinai for a little bit of yet. So we're still here getting ready to proceed to the promised land. And remember, the land itself is actually the true embodiment of their relationship with God. The land is a picture of heaven, of course, but it's also a picture pointing backwards of what Eden coulda, shoulda, woulda been. Adam and Eve sinned. They were sent into exile, kicked out. Israel has not yet arrived. They're heading that way for that close, intimate relationship with God. This is how they're going to maintain it. Keep these rules. Be pure as God has outlined what he's looking for. As we've gone through, we've seen in chapter 11, talking about the dietary rules, really, where Moses, for God, has made the distinction between clean and unclean animals. Which ones they can eat, which ones they can't. Talked about land animals, talked about birds, talked about fish. It's interesting, we were just talking about this today in my classes, and the students were kind of flummoxed that it's been since Genesis chapter 7, since when God first introduced the idea of clean and unclean, before he finally explains to them what it is. He prepared them for it, now they're finally getting it. So what can they or can they not eat? Chapter 12 is the short little one, if you remember from several weeks ago now, that talks about the after effects of childbirth. For how long is the woman unclean? How does she right, if you will, that relationship with God in terms of the sacrifices and so forth? Chapter 13 has all been, how many ever weeks we've now been at it, it's all been dedicated to various skin conditions. If this, then that. How do you know? What does it look like? What do you do? Of the 59 verses, the first 46 were all about diagnosis. If your skin presents with this symptom, go to the priest, show yourself to him. He'll tell you what to do next. And in every case, it always came down to the question of, are they clean or unclean? Those with infectious diseases, these skin diseases that are spreading, those folks are unclean. And we pointed out early on, and have repeated it probably every week, that the idea of it being a spreading infection means that it's leprous. That these are all not just dealing with leprosy as we think about it. All of these various conditions are leprous because they spread not only on your skin, but potentially spread to others as well. The rest of the chapter now, what we looked at last week, what we're wrapping up tonight, is focusing on diseases that are on garments or cloths, including skins. I didn't have room. Didn't want to add a line just for that, but things that are wearable, things that are usable, water skins, things that you have in the house that you would touch regularly. Everybody's, was it you, Gary? All right. I recognize the sound. I've got a student who wears one, so I'm used to hearing it. Just wasn't sure whose it was. But these are things that you can touch that could potentially transfer disease to you. These are not just clothing that the disease people have had. This is other things going on in your home amongst garments or other materials. Most likely culprit, the most likely diseases that are in consideration here, even though Moses doesn't call it this, is what we would call mold, particularly black mold, or even mildew. Some of you know what happens if you leave a damp rag rolled up and balled up on the floor. If you leave it too long, now what do? Can you kill off what's starting to grow on it? And as we saw last week, and we'll see a hint a little bit tonight, the testing procedures for these materials is essentially the same. If you're at home, you see this on one of your cloths, you take it to the priest. You make sure that it's clean or unclean. If he's not sure, if it looks like it might be, but he's not sure, there's a waiting period. It's put into isolation. How long? 7 days. That way you don't make a premature, mistaken diagnosis. If at the end of 7 days it has spread, the garment, the cloth, the skin, whatever it is to be burned, destroyed. You can't wash it. I doubt they had some form of equivalency of bleach back then. So the answer is toss in the fire, be done with it. As I was emphasizing this morning with my students, think about it. You're living in close community. There's 1.5 million or more of them together, living in the wilderness, in the desert, here at Sinai, on the way to the promised land. And of course, God knows and we know what's going to happen for 40 more years after that. They don't have a permanent water supply. They're traveling from oasis to oasis. Where is cleanliness in the list of priorities? Have you heard anybody so far in Exodus complain about Moses, where's the bathtub? They've complained about the food. They've complained about water. They've complained about the leadership. It's kind of like being a pastor, isn't it? The potluck wasn't very good this month, Pastor. Do I look like I cooked it? Any of these skin diseases that could take off or start runs the risk of quickly spreading through the camp. And it's interesting, it didn't dawn on me till today, talking to my students. We've now lived through something similar to this. Now, some of you have lived through skin outbreaks, or what, but I'm talking about COVID. We went from little snot-nosed kids being dropped off by their parents in Sunday school, at daycare, parents dropping off even though they had a temperature because they didn't have anybody else. Now what do? I don't feel good, stay home. Right? We, in fact, now beg people. We miss you, but not that much. And now with the current outbreak of whatever version this is of COVID, by the way, COVID never goes away. There's always a version. But we now are much more cautious about, man, I don't feel good. You know, a student walks in my office and I go, you feel okay? And I'm thinking they just look like they're down. Well, I'm feeling kind of achy. Why are you in my office? Right? I lean over, turn a fan on, aim it towards the door. Because what are we afraid of? How many people would it have taken to bring COVID into our congregation and killed one of our senior adults? Just one. And if you remember early on in the spring of 20, That was happening in a lot of more traditional churches, particularly among their choirs, because they'd be in close proximity, breathing heavily, singing out in a little small room like ours, and 13, 14 people end up with COVID. And so we've kind of been through this. So imagine that with a whole lot more people than are in Charleston without water to cleanse yourself or your clothing. And we're talking about all these infectious diseases. And so you can see why this is for them not only a matter of what do we eat, what do we do with women who've had children, this is literally a matter of life and death in many cases. Because if you don't get it diagnosed at home, your whole family could end up with whatever skin problem. If you don't take care of your materials and your cloths, the next person who picks it up to move it when you move the next day to the next site could pick up that infection themselves. Those of you know mold, right? You got it inside your tent, you pick up your tent, you fold it, you move. What are you doing with all the spores? You spread them all around to everybody who's in the room when you're doing it. So you get an idea of just how real the problem is here. And these are not just spiritual problems. They have spiritual implications. You get kicked out of the camp, you're in trouble. But these have real everyday problems connected to them. And so this is God's way of not only testing them, will you be obedient to me? This is God's way of protecting them. And so here we are wrapping up tonight the last little bit of this as we finish up chapter 13. So let's go ahead and start at verse 53 and do the last three paragraphs. And, so we're kind of picking up in the middle where we stopped last Wednesday night. And if the priest examines, and if the disease has not spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or any article made of skin, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which is the disease, and he shall shut it up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine the diseased thing after it has been washed. And if the appearance of the diseased area has not changed, though the disease has not spread, it is unclean. You shall burn it in the fire, whether the rot is on the front or on the back. But if the priest examines, and if the diseased area has faded after it has been washed, he shall tear it out of the garment or the skin or the warp or the woof. And then if it appears again in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or any article made of skin, it's spreading. You shall burn with fire whatever has the disease. But the garment or the warp or the woof, or any article made of skin from which the disease departs, when you have washed it, then it shall then be washed a second time and be clean. This is the law for a case of leprous disease in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, to determine whether it is clean or unclean. And so, here's Moses' way of writing in it. A lot of repetition, a lot of specificity. This is how serious God takes this. A lot of, what about? Well, let me cover that what about for you as he goes. So let's just quickly kind of work through this and think about what's going on. We ended last week with bring the cloth to the priest. He looks at it, puts it into isolation. If in 7 days it's clearly spread, it's clearly unclean. Right? There's no need to even worry about it. It's clear. It's spreading further. Burn it. This paragraph starting in verse 53 is all about what if it hasn't spread, but it hasn't receded either. Now what do you do? And so here picking up verse 53, these potentially infected items still taken to the priest for consideration. Remember, the priest is not the voodoo doctor, the witch doctor. He's kind of the health authority in the camp. So take it to the priest. If the item is suspicious, we've seen this already, what do? Quarantine it for 7 days. Number of completion, fulfillment. Now, verse 54. If in those 7 days the infection has not spread, i.e. it's isolated, doesn't seem like it's spreading, now it must be washed, cleansed. Now, by the way, did you notice, looking back at verse 54, who's doing the washing? They. In other words, it's not the priest doing the washing. Who's washing it? You're washing your own clothes or your own garments. Because what does the priest not want? Whatever cooties you brought into the No, you touch it. I can see it from here, thank you. Those of you who are parents, you've had this conversation with your kids. Mom, look, I don't need to see it. I can see it from here. Go wash it. And so you go and wash it. Then you wait another 7 days. So again, exactly paralleling what's going on with the humans with the skin conditions earlier in the chapter. On the second seventh day, so day 14, the priest is going to examine it again. He's looking for one of two possibilities now. If the diseased area is unchanged, you washed it, the spot, the mark is still there, item's unclean because the washing didn't do any good. Can't eradicate it with probably lye soap or some form of that and water. It's unclean. So what do you do with the item? Got to be burned. End of story. That's it. I did find it interesting there at the end of verse 55 where Moses makes it clear the location of the affected, shouldn't be affection, the affected area, the location doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's front or back is what he says. And when I first read that, I went, why would that be an issue? You know, but I think what the issue is here is how expensive and precious is cloth or skins. You're the owner, you don't want to just throw it away. So it may be, well, if I can't see it, is it okay if I wear it? I'm thinking, though, it's probably not front and back. Front and back. Doesn't matter if it touches your skin or it's on the outside, the cloth's ruined. Right? Think about a house, and there's going to be language about houses later. If your house has black mold, does it matter if it's in a room you don't use? No. You got a problem, you need to deal with it. And so I think that's what he's driving at, the front or back language here. Don't scrimp. Don't try to save. Don't try to rationalize in your mind. It's not that bad. Front or back, inside or outside, it's ruined, burned. The next paragraph repeats or continues that same hypothetical scene. You've taken the cloth, the priest has examined it, it's clearly infected, burn it. If it's not sure, quarantine it, wait 7 days, check it, wash it, wait 7 more days, clean or unclean. What if we've got this cloth, we've taken it, the priest has looked at it, we've quarantined it, but now, verse 56, what if after the 7 days, the spot is actually faded? What if it seems to be going away? That infected area should be removed. Cut it out. Now, here again is this fiscal reality of you can't afford to just throw away every piece of clothing you got. So if the spot, it seems to be going away, so it's probably not mold or infectious, you cut that spot out and you replace it. Prolong the life of that cloth. You know, some of you older folks in the room cringe when you see the younger generation walking around in jeans that have more holes than material. Everybody over the age of 70 is going, because what would you have done? You wouldn't have thrown them away either, most of you. What would you have done? You've been watching patch, right? You know, the pants would be stiff because there's so many patches. That's what they're doing. They're patching them, trying to prolong the life of this stuff. Especially given, again, remember, we know, they don't. They're about to spend 40 years roaming around in the wilderness. And while God will promise them in the book of Numbers, up around chapter 10, your shoes won't wear out and your clothing won't wear out, what will cause the wear out? If you don't take care of this problem when it starts to arise. So if it's been investigated, inspected, 7 days, it seems to be going away, cut it out, throw away the infected area, patch it is implied, and take it home with you. But, verse 57, if another spot has shown up somewhere else on the piece, so it's not it's spread from here to here, now it's on this sleeve, the disease is spreading. It's leprous. And what do you do with that garment or fabric or warp and woof or skin? Burn it. It needs to be burned. So here are all these what ifs, Moses. Well, let me tell you what if. If, as you look at it, you've cut out the patch, if that's the case, or burned it, but assuming you've cut out the patch, you're good to go. If you don't see the disease anywhere else, got to wash the garment again. Got to be washed again. And then it's considered clean. There's still another washing, another cleansing before you take home your piece. Verse 59 is our little short summary paragraph for this whole chapter that we've been working through now for weeks. Let's go ahead and reread it just since it is the summary statement. This is the law for a case of leprous disease in a garment of wool or linen, so it doesn't matter wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof. There's some debate, is that a different type of fabric, or is he just talking about what part of the piece it's in, or any article made of skin to determine whether it is clean or unclean. Very simple statement, but I think it's helpful for us to kind of wrap this up. Since next Wednesday night we have the business meeting, it'll be 2 weeks before the prayer group meets again at 6, and 2 weeks before we pick up chapter 14. So here's Moses wrapping all this up, packaging this part in a similar way as something he packaged earlier. Everything that been just said, going all the way back to verse 47 last week about clothing or cloth, wrapping it all up tonight about cloth, 47 to 58, we need to make sure, they need to make sure that they understand it to be a law. Understood to be a law. This is not God's suggestion. This is not God saying, think about it if something seems a little off with your clothing. This is a law. Moses used the same exact kind of language back at the end of chapter 11 when he talked about all the animals. This is the law that the God had given to the people. And so, just as serious as God is about the clean and unclean animals, he's just as serious now about clean and unclean cloth. Just because it's clothing, not your skin, it's no less important. Just because it's a tablecloth or a face cloth, not any less important than it was if you were eating pork. Why? Here's why. Israel's covenant relationship with God is driving this whole thing, both the necessity and the specificity. In other words, they're in relationship with God now. They're in a covenant. And to remain in the covenant, to remain in God's presence, to enjoy God's presence when you get to the land, you've got to remain clean. You've got to remain pure. And so, in many ways, this is a spiritual matter, even though all these things have been very practical. And so, here's a perfect example of something we've talked about in the past with covenants. To preserve their relationship with God, to stay in his presence, they've got to adhere to the stipulations of the covenant. Think back to the Ten Commandments. It's the perfect embodiment, even the way Moses spells it out. It's a perfect illustration of this. Exodus chapter 20. God has led them out of Egypt. He's brought them through the Red Sea. He's brought them to the bottom of Mount Sinai. Moses has gone up on the mountain, received the Ten Commandments. And the way the Ten Commandments begin, Exodus 20, verse 1, doesn't begin with a thou shalt or thou shalt not. It begins with, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up by a strong hand out of the hand of Egypt, or out of the house of slavery. So I've already rescued you. This is not about do this to be saved. The Old Testament is not a covenant of works. God has already rescued them. What the Ten Commandments are the stipulations of the covenant. Because I've rescued you, because I own you, you will live this way. Because who's supposed to commit murder? Nobody's supposed to commit murder. So why tell the Israelites that special after everybody else has already been told that back in Genesis chapter 9? Because the concept is, because you're my people, you won't do this. Our relationship changes everything, even down to questions about what do you do with clothes that might be ruined with some sort of disease. And so what Moses has done, and we've talked about this a few times over the last several weeks as we've gone through the purity codes all together, there is this connection, isn't there? A very real connection between the physical world and the spiritual world. What you do with your body has spiritual implications. It's not just simply spiritual in that God said it, so you better do it. That is true. God said it. That's the end of it. But here are some things that, to our minds, to our sensibilities, we're going, really? Does it matter what you eat? Well, physically, yeah, because if you don't cook it correct, you get sick or worse. But there's also the element, God said it, shouldn't that be any more discussion? How many of you have told your kids, what's the infamous last words every kid hates to hear? Because I said so. And then what do you do when they keep nagging, whining, asking? Do you need me to pull the car over? No, ma'am. That's the end of it. But a lot of those rules you gave your kids were also for their benefit, right? I'm not telling you don't get near the stove because I don't want you to have fun. In fact, I'm telling you don't get near the stove because I want you to be able to have fun. So there's a physical and there's an obedience issue. And obedience is a spiritual matter. The two are interconnected. And the point is, as I got there on the handout, this just really in one sense highlights this comprehensive nature of their relationship with God. You can't put God in a box. You can't live your religion in a silo. Generations and generations of Christians ever, but certainly in the South, have tried that. When you talk about cultural Christianity in America, what are we really talking about? The so-called Bible Belt. Because everybody went to the church in the 1950s, early 60s. But did they act like they went to church? No. That's why some of you rebelled against your parents' view of church for a while. Some of you walked away and came back later in life. Or some of you swore, I'm not going to do church the way my mom and dad did church. Which is what we're also seeing with your children's generation. And now we're also seeing with Brian's generation. Unfortunately, many of the younger generation want nothing to do with theology. They just want to do. And you talk theology and they glaze over. Because what did they see? Mom and dad emphasizing theology because the generation before them didn't. But what did mom and dad turn out to be? Just as hypocritical as their mom and dad. And Brian's heard me say this, my students hear me. Here's the warning. One day you're going to be just as hypocritical. So get off your high horse and quit pointing fingers at them. Change your generation rather than complaining about the other one. But it's all connected. Your relationship with God is more than just Sunday morning or your quiet time. It's supposed to play out everywhere. And so what Moses is kind of starting to reiterate, he's going to get hard into this in a few chapters and down the road for us. He's going to tell us, you must be holy because God is holy, right? Well, to be holy, among other things, means to be completely set apart for God's purposes. And so if God says you can't use this for that, you can't use it. If God says you have to do it this way, not that way, that's what you have to do. Nadab and Abihu learned that lesson the hard way, those of you who know who I'm talking about. They didn't do it God's way, and what did God do? They were unclean. Burn, baby, burn. Priests. By the way, it highlights how the system's never going to work. Because if the people who are supposed to take you to God can't get to God, they can't take you either. But it's about being holy. This is where the book of Leviticus is ultimately going, right? This is what we're looking for. Not just purity. We're looking for holiness. And that means the motive and the method are interconnected. Why you do it is just as important as how you do it. This is Jesus' lesson to the Pharisees in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, don't do this. I'm telling you, don't even think about it. It's motive and method. Or, put it in one other way, and we'll wrap this up, faith and obedience are two sides of the same coin. You can't divorce the two. If you are faithful, you will be obedient. Your obedience counts for nothing if you're not also faithful. Why do you think Jesus spends so much time with the Pharisees in the New Testament? Because they were closer than anybody. They had the right concern, the wrong method. They equated getting to God's presence as being obedient, and Jesus kept pointing out, but your heart's wrong. And so he talks to the Pharisees more than anybody else except the apostles. He eventually gets tired of them and scolds them. You whitewashed fences. But early on, he's trying to work with them because we're all going for the same objective. The problem is your way of getting there is like the Tower of Babel. You're building this high tower, and what's it doing for you? Nothing, except going to ultimately push you farther away from God. Faith and obedience, motive and method, all interconnected. You can't have it one or the other. God's looking for both. Let's go ahead and pray. Scott can come home and get the rest of the answers for Roxanne. And then we'll all retreat and prepare for Sunday morning as we continue to work our way through Timothy. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your goodness, your mercy. Ask, Lord, your blessings on the reading of your word. Help us, Lord, as Gentiles living thousands upon thousands of years after the fact. Help us to understand what these laws were about and what they still have to do with us. How are we to read them? How are we to understand them? How are we to live in light of what you've said? Because as Timothy's going to tell us sometime next spring, all Scripture is God-breathed. It's all profitable for all these things. You've given it, Lord, so that the man of God might be made complete. All Scripture, Lord. That's what you've said. Help us believe that. And Lord, help us to live that. For all this we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.